I signed the divorce papers in front of my wife's entire family. They were smiling. She was smiling. Then my lawyer walked in with a folder that said I'm worth $500 million. Nobody was smiling after that. Before we dive into how everything unraveled, if you've ever felt invisible, underestimated, or dismissed by people who thought they were better than you, this story is for you. Hit that like button. You'll understand why by the end. And subscribe, because stories like this, stories about quiet victories and poetic justice, don't tell themselves. Someone has to be here to share them. 6 years before that moment in the lawyer's office, I was someone completely different. Or rather, I was exactly the same person, just wearing a different mask. My name is Darius Webb, and back then, I'd just walked away from everything I'd built in Silicon Valley. 2 successful exits. 2 companies that went from ideas scribbled on napkins to acquisitions that made headlines in TechCrunch and Forbes. The second sale netted me $120 million after taxes and distributions to early investors. I was 32 years old, exhausted, and deeply, fundamentally tired of being seen as a dollar sign with a pulse. The Valley does that to you. Success becomes your identity. Your net worth becomes your name. People stop seeing you and start seeing your portfolio. My first serious relationship had imploded under the weight of it all. She'd loved the lifestyle more than she'd ever loved me, and when I finally admitted that to myself, something inside me broke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet fracture that made me realize I needed to disappear for a while. Martha's Vineyard in late September felt like stepping into a different dimension. The summer crowds had thinned. The air carried that specific autumn crispness that makes you want to walk for hours without purpose. I booked 2 weeks at a small boutique hotel, the kind of place that didn't care about my LinkedIn profile or my exit valuations. I checked in wearing joggers and a faded Howard University hoodie, driving a rental Toyota that had seen better days. The young woman at the front desk smiled at me like I was just another guest, not a tech founder, not a millionaire, just a tired-looking black man who needed a place to rest. That anonymity felt like oxygen after years of suffocating. I met Jasmine Whitmore on my second day there. She was standing in the hotel lobby, designer luggage scattered around her like expensive breadcrumbs, looking frustrated in that particular way wealthy people do when service isn't materializing fast enough. Her silk blouse probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her Cartier watch caught the afternoon light coming through the tall windows. Everything about her screamed old money, the kind that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. She looked directly at me, took in my casual clothes and my proximity to her bags, and made an assumption. Would I mind helping her with her luggage? Room for 12. She'd tip well. I should have corrected her. Should have explained that I was a guest, not staff. But something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was exhaustion with my real life. Maybe I just wanted to see what it felt like to be invisible in a different way. So I picked up her bags and carried them to the elevator without saying a word. She talked the entire way up. About her friend's wedding that weekend. About how Martha's Vineyard had become so pedestrian compared to the Amalfi Coast. About her family's summer home in the Hamptons. She had this way of speaking that assumed you'd be fascinated by her life, that your entire existence would be enriched just by proximity to her stories. And maybe she was right, in a way. I was fascinated. Just not in the way she imagined. When we reached her room, she pressed a $50 bill into my hand with a smile that was probably meant to be kind but landed somewhere closer to condescending. She told me her name was Jasmine and that if I was working the weekend, she'd request me specifically for her group's needs. I pocketed the $50 and told her I'd see what I could do. Over the next 3 days, we kept running into each other. She was everywhere: the hotel restaurant, the walking paths along the beach, the small bookstore in town. Each time, her attitude shifted slightly. The condescension softened into something more curious. She started asking questions. What did I do when I wasn't working at the hotel? Did I live on the island year-round? Had I always worked in hospitality? I told her I was between opportunities, taking some time to figure out my next move. It was technically true. I just omitted the part where my next move involved deciding which board positions to accept and which venture capital firms to angel invest with. She found my vagueness intriguing, called it refreshing, said most men she met couldn't stop talking about themselves, their accomplishments, their ambitions. My silence became magnetic to her in a way my success never could have been. By the 4th day, we were having coffee together. By the 5th, she'd invited me to her friend's wedding as her +1. By the time I left Martha's Vineyard 2 weeks later, we'd exchanged numbers and she'd made me promise to visit her in Boston. If you're watching this and you've ever hidden parts of yourself to be loved, you understand what I was doing. You understand the loneliness of wondering if people would choose you without the accomplishments, without the status, without the proof of your worth stamped on a bank statement. Drop a like if you get it. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they're enough, exactly as they are. Because that's what I was searching for, even if I didn't have the words for it yet. The first time I met Jasmine's father, Reginald Whitmore III, he looked at me the way you might look at something unpleasant you've discovered on the bottom of your shoe. We were at their family home in Beacon Hill, one of those historic brownstones that had been in the Whitmore family for 4 generations. Oil paintings of stern-looking ancestors lined the walls. The furniture was the kind of expensive that's meant to be admired, not actually sat on. Everything in that house whispered old money, old traditions, old certainties about how the world should be ordered. Reginald was a managing partner at one of Boston's most prestigious private equity firms. The kind of man who wore his Yale degree and his country club membership like armor. He'd built his career on his family's connections and his own ruthless competence, and he expected the world to arrange itself according to his preferences. His daughter dating a man he perceived as beneath their station was not part of his preferred arrangement. Jasmine had warned me. Her father was particular about who she dated. Her previous boyfriend had been from a prominent Boston family, Harvard law graduate, already making partner track at a white-shoe law firm. That relationship had ended badly. He'd cheated, she'd found out, but her father had still suggested she consider forgiving him because of his pedigree. That's when she decided to rebel in the only way she knew how, by dating someone her father would never approve of. I was that someone. Dinner that first night was an exercise in subtle humiliation. Reginald asked about my background with the kind of false interest that barely masked his disdain. Where had I gone to school? What did my parents do? What exactly did between opportunities mean in practical terms? Each question was a small knife, precisely placed. His wife, Eleanor, was softer in her approach but no less judgmental. She asked about my family with the kind of sympathy you might extend to someone discussing a terminal illness. Jasmine's older brother, Terence, mostly ignored me, clearly having decided I wasn't worth his attention. I answered their questions honestly, just incompletely. Yes, I'd grown up in a working-class neighborhood in Atlanta. Yes, my parents were immigrants who'd worked multiple jobs to put me through school. Yes, I'd gone to Howard instead of an Ivy League school. Yes, I was currently exploring my options instead of locked into a traditional career path. Every answer seemed to confirm what they'd already decided about me. The thing about wealthy families like the Whitmores is that they have a very specific script for how life should unfold. The right schools leading to the right careers, leading to the right neighborhoods, leading to the right social circles. Deviation from that script isn't seen as independence or creativity. It's seen as failure, or worse, as not knowing your place. I was disrupting their script just by existing in Jasmine's life. What made it bearable, almost amusing, was knowing what they didn't. While Reginald was internally calculating whether I was after his daughter's trust fund, I was mentally reviewing my own investment portfolio. While Eleanor was probably wondering if I'd ever be able to support their daughter in the manner to which she was accustomed, I was sitting on liquid assets that would make their family's net worth look quaint. While Terence was dismissing me as irrelevant, I was days away from closing an angel investment in a biotech startup that would eventually return 40 times my initial stake. But I said nothing. I played the role they'd written for me. The struggling entrepreneur. The working-class boyfriend trying his best. The man who should be grateful for their tolerance of his presence in their daughter's life. Jasmine, for her part, seemed to relish the tension. She'd squeeze my hand under the table when her father was being particularly cutting. She'd defend me in ways that were sweet but also revealed how little she actually understood about who I was. She'd tell her parents I was brilliant, hard-working, authentic. She'd talk about how refreshing it was to be with someone who hadn't been handed everything in life. She meant it as a compliment, but there was condescension baked into it. I was her rebellion. Her proof that she wasn't shallow or materialistic like the rest of her family. I was her social justice project in human form. I let her believe it because the alternative, revealing my actual net worth, my actual accomplishments, my actual life, would have changed everything. And I needed to know. Needed to understand if someone could love me without the resume, without the bank statements, without the proof that I deserved love in the first place. For those of you watching who've ever felt like you had to prove your worth to be loved, subscribe to this channel. These stories matter. Your story matters. And sometimes hearing someone else's journey helps you understand your own. Hit that notification bell because what comes next will make you believe in perfect timing. 8 months into our relationship, I proposed to Jasmine on a quiet beach at sunset. Nothing elaborate. No flash mob or skywriting or photographers hiding in the dunes. Just me, her, and a modest engagement ring I'd purchased from a small jewelry store in Cambridge. By modest, I mean it cost about $3,000, expensive for most people, laughably cheap by the standards of the world she came from. She said yes immediately, tears streaming down her face, telling me it was perfect, that I was perfect, that she didn't need some ostentatious display of wealth to know this was right. Her family's reaction was less enthusiastic. Reginald requested a meeting with me. Just the two of us. Man to man. He took me to his club, one of those old Boston institutions where portraits of former members line the walls and the staff move through rooms with the silence of people who've perfected the art of being invisible while still being indispensable. We sat in leather chairs that had probably witnessed 100 similar conversations, fathers attempting to protect their daughters from unsuitable matches, younger men being measured and found wanting. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. His daughter was making a mistake. I seemed like a nice enough young man, but nice wasn't enough. Jasmine had expectations, a lifestyle she'd been raised in. Could I provide that? Did I have any assets? Any real prospects? He wasn't trying to be cruel, he explained, just realistic. Love was wonderful, but love didn't pay for private schools or country club memberships or the kind of life his daughter deserved. I could have ended it right there. Could have pulled up my bank statement on my phone and watched his face change. Could have told him about the companies I'd built, the board seats I'd been offered, the venture capital firms that called me when they wanted someone to evaluate promising startups. Could have explained that I could buy his club if I wanted to. Instead, I told him I understood his concerns. Told him I was working on building something sustainable. Told him I loved his daughter and would do everything in my power to make her happy. He looked at me with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. With men like Reginald, those two emotions often looked the same. Then he told me about the prenup. No prenuptial agreement, no wedding. It was that simple. Jasmine had a trust fund, $2 million that would become accessible when she married. The family also had significant assets that would eventually be inherited. The prenup would protect those assets. Surely I could understand that. It was just good business. Nothing personal. Everything about it was personal, of course. The prenup wasn't about protecting Jasmine's assets. It was about putting me in my place. About making sure I understood that I was marrying up, that I should be grateful for the opportunity, that I would never truly be part of their family. It was a legal document that codified their disdain. Reginald had his attorneys draw up the papers. They were thorough in their humiliation. The prenup specified that Jasmine's trust fund and any future inheritance would remain separate property. If the marriage ended before 10 years, I would receive nothing, regardless of the circumstances. There were lifestyle clauses. I was required to maintain employment and contribute financially to the household. There was an infidelity clause with teeth. Any spouse who cheated would forfeit all claims to community property. The document was designed to protect Jasmine's assets from me. That was its entire purpose. What it didn't mention, what no one thought to include, were provisions about my assets. Because no one believed I had any worth protecting. The signing happened at the rehearsal dinner, 2 nights before the wedding. The Whitmores wanted witnesses. Wanted to make sure this moment was remembered. Reginald's attorneys were there. Family friends who were also lawyers reviewed the documents. Everyone in that room knew what was happening. I was signing away any claim to the Whitmore fortune. I was acknowledging my place in the hierarchy. I was accepting the terms of my inclusion in their world. Jasmine looked uncomfortable but didn't object. Her mother patted my hand and told me this was just a formality. Terence smirked from across the room. Reginald watched with the satisfaction of a man who'd successfully protected his assets from a fortune hunter. I signed every page without reading them. Didn't ask questions. Didn't request time to have my own lawyer review the terms. Just signed my name in all the places they'd marked with little yellow arrows. Reginald raised his glass for a toast afterward. Welcomed me to the family with words that were meant to sound gracious but carried an unmistakable subtext: don't get too comfortable. What none of them understood, what they couldn't have understood, was that their prenup was functionally meaningless. It protected Jasmine's $2 million. My portfolio at that point was worth $207 million. Their carefully crafted legal document didn't mention my assets because they didn't know my assets existed. And in Massachusetts, a prenup that only addresses one spouse's property while remaining silent on the others creates some interesting legal vulnerabilities. But I wasn't thinking about legal vulnerabilities that night. I was thinking about how it felt to be judged so completely, to be measured and dismissed, to have your worth determined by people who couldn't see past their own assumptions. I was thinking about how Jasmine had watched me sign away my rights without once asking if I wanted my own legal representation. I was thinking about how her family's contempt was so casual, so reflexive, that they didn't even recognize it as contempt. Mostly, I was thinking about how I'd created this situation. How I'd chosen invisibility and was now dealing with its consequences. If you've ever felt unseen by the people who claim to love you, this next part will resonate. Make sure you're subscribed because this story is about to take a turn that changes everything. Share it with someone who needs to remember that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage you can have. The early days of marriage were a study in cognitive dissonance. Jasmine and I moved into a beautiful brownstone in Back Bay that she believed her father had purchased as a wedding gift. What she didn't know was that I bought the property 3 weeks before the wedding, paid cash, and put the title solely in my name. The Whitmores thought they were being generous. I let them think it. The mortgage statements went to a P.O. box they didn't know existed. I maintained my cover carefully. Told Jasmine I was working on a new startup, which was technically true. I spent my days in coffee shops with my laptop, taking meetings over Zoom, reviewing pitch decks from founders who wanted me to angel invest. To anyone watching, I looked like every other would-be entrepreneur in Boston, grinding away, hoping for a breakthrough, living on ambition and optimism while my wife's family money kept us comfortable. What I was actually doing was managing a portfolio that was growing faster than I'd anticipated. The biotech investment I'd made right before meeting Jasmine had gone public. My stake was now worth $80 million. I'd taken positions in 3 other startups that were showing extraordinary promise. My wealth management team at Blackstone sent me quarterly reports that tracked my net worth climbing steadily upward. By our first anniversary, I'd crossed $250 million. Jasmine knew none of this. She'd see me on my laptop and ask how the startup was going. I'd give vague answers about product development and market research. She'd nod sympathetically and remind me that there was no pressure, that we were comfortable enough, that success would come in time. Her reassurances were meant to be supportive but carried the implicit message that she was the one providing stability while I chased my dreams. Her family was less diplomatic about their assessment of my prospects. Thanksgiving dinner at the Whitmore estate became an annual tradition of subtle humiliation. Reginald would ask about my work with the kind of false interest that barely masked his impatience. When would this startup actually launch? Had I considered more traditional employment? He had contacts who might be able to help me find something suitable. The word suitable carried the weight of centuries of class consciousness. He meant entry-level. He meant appropriate for someone of my background. Christmas was worse. Terence, who'd made senior vice president at his father's firm, gave me a gift certificate to a professional development course. Career Pivot Strategies for Mid-Level Professionals. He thought it was helpful. Jasmine thought it was thoughtful. I thought it was a masterclass in passive aggression wrapped in expensive paper. Eleanor's approach was softer but no less damaging. She'd pull me aside at family gatherings and tell me how proud they all were of my perseverance. She'd mention other young men she knew who'd struggled to find their footing. She'd suggest that perhaps I was being too ambitious, that there was no shame in a more modest life. She'd pat my hand and tell me that Jasmine had married me for love, not money, and that was what mattered. The thing about being underestimated is that it's exhausting in ways people don't talk about. Every family dinner was a reminder that they judged me and found me lacking. Every sympathetic comment from Eleanor was a reinforcement of their belief that I was failing. Every smirk from Terence was a confirmation that I didn't belong in their world. And Jasmine, my wife, the woman who claimed to love me authentically, never once questioned their narrative. She absorbed their assessment of me and made it her own. Slowly, imperceptibly, she began to change. The first year of marriage, she defended me when her family made their cutting remarks. She'd squeeze my hand under the table and later tell me to ignore them, that they didn't understand what we had. But by the second year, the defenses became less frequent. She'd laugh along with her brother's jokes about my perpetual startup. She'd nod when her father suggested I should consider more stable employment. She'd mention, casually, that she'd been thinking about going back to work at the family foundation, not because we needed the money, but because she was bored. That word, bored, started appearing with increasing frequency. She was bored with our quiet evenings at home. Bored with our modest lifestyle. Bored with my lack of visible success. She started spending more time with her single friends from college, women who'd married investment bankers and doctors, and men whose success was obvious and traditional. She'd come home from lunch with these friends and make little comments about their husbands' achievements. Nothing direct. Just observations. Just comparisons that she'd leave hanging in the air between us. Year 3 was when she joined the country club and took up tennis. For anyone watching who's seen a relationship deteriorate in slow motion, you know what I'm describing. It's not one moment. It's 1,000 small moments. It's the accumulation of disappointments and unmet expectations. It's the gradual realization that the person you married isn't who you thought they were, or isn't who you needed them to be. Hit that like button if you've been there. And stick around, because this is where the story starts accelerating toward its inevitable conclusion. His name was Marcus. He was 28 years old, all charm and angles, with a kind of effortless confidence that came from being attractive enough that the world had always arranged itself in his favor. He taught tennis at the country club, gave private lessons to bored spouses, and had the kind of smile that suggested he knew exactly how attractive he was and exactly how to leverage that attractiveness. Jasmine started with group lessons. Then private lessons. Then extra sessions that somehow always ran long. She'd come home flushed and energized, talking about her backhand improving, about how Marcus really understood her playing style, about how therapeutic it was to have something that was just hers. I knew exactly what was happening. I'd known men like Marcus my entire life. Charming opportunists who saw wealthy, unfulfilled women as career opportunities. I'd known women like Jasmine too, raised with every advantage but fundamentally insecure, hungry for validation, susceptible to anyone who made them feel seen in ways their actual lives didn't provide. I could have confronted her immediately. Could have sat her down and told her I knew about the affair before it had even fully started. Could have reminded her about the infidelity clause in the prenup that she'd insisted I sign. Could have ended things right there. But I didn't. Because something in me needed to see how far this would go. Needed to understand exactly who I'd married. Needed to watch the slow-motion car crash of her choices play out to their natural conclusion. So I did something else instead. I hired a private investigator. Her name was Keisha Rodriguez, and she was exactly the kind of professional I needed, discreet, thorough, completely uninterested in judgment or drama. She'd worked corporate espionage before transitioning to private investigation. She understood how to document without being seen, how to gather evidence that would stand up in legal proceedings, how to build a narrative from the scattered pieces of someone's hidden life. I gave her a simple assignment: document everything. The tennis lessons. The lunch dates. The text messages. The growing intimacy. The moment it crossed from emotional affair to physical affair. All of it. Keisha did more than document. She got creative. She joined the country club as a new member, took a few lessons from Marcus herself. She became friendly with him in the casual way that people do at clubs. She mentioned, carefully, that she'd recently inherited some money from an uncle. Nothing ostentatious. Just enough to be interesting. Marcus, being Marcus, couldn't help himself. He flirted. He suggested drinks. And during those drinks, with Keisha's phone recording every word, he talked. About his regulars. About the women who hired him for private lessons and ended up wanting something more private. About how it was basically a side hustle. About how he'd recently connected with someone especially promising, older than his usual clients, beautiful, from serious money, currently unhappy in her marriage to some deadbeat who couldn't get his act together. That conversation alone would have been enough. But Keisha kept going. She documented the afternoon in September when Jasmine and Marcus were both mysteriously unavailable, then found them together at a boutique hotel in Cambridge. She photographed them having lunch at restaurants in suburbs far enough from Boston that Jasmine must have thought she was safe from recognition. She accessed Marcus's phone through methods I didn't ask about and probably didn't want to know, finding months of text messages that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The messages were devastating in their banality. Jasmine writing about how Marcus made her feel alive again. How she'd made a mistake marrying someone she'd had to rescue. How she deserved more than a husband who couldn't provide the lifestyle she'd been raised in. Marcus responding with calculated encouragement, telling her she was too good for her current situation. Mentioning, carefully, how much he admired successful, independent women. Dropping hints about his own financial struggles, his dreams of opening his own tennis academy, how he just needed the right partner, the right opportunity. He was positioning himself as her next relationship. The upgrade. The man who appreciated her properly. And Jasmine, hungry for validation, blind to the obvious calculation, was falling for it completely. While I was watching all of this unfold, while Keisha was building her dossier, my actual life was progressing in ways none of them knew about. One of my early investments, a fintech startup I'd angel-funded 5 years earlier, got acquired by Goldman Sachs. My stake in that company alone netted me $140 million. Another company I'd advised went public, and the stock options they'd granted me as compensation were suddenly worth $35 million. By our third anniversary, I'd crossed $400 million. By the time Jasmine started seriously planning her exit from our marriage, I was worth $480 million. By the time her father offered me $50,000 to disappear quietly and spare the family embarrassment, my portfolio had hit $500 million. The irony was almost beautiful. While Jasmine was planning to trade up to a tennis instructor she thought could offer her something better, while her family was counting down the days until they could officially write me off as their daughter's failed experiment in slumming, I had quietly become wealthier than their entire family combined. Reginald's private equity firm had assets under management that sounded impressive until you realized how many partners split those returns. The Whitmore family fortune, accumulated over generations, was substantial. But it wasn't $500 million of liquid assets substantial. It wasn't fuck you money substantial. It wasn't walk away from everything and never think about money again substantial. I was no longer just wealthy. I was free. And they had no idea. Subscribe if you want to see how this ends. Share this with someone who's ever been underestimated. Turn on notifications because the confrontation that's coming will restore your faith in karma. This is where 3 years of playing poor pays off in ways you can't imagine. The setup for the final act came from Jasmine herself. She wanted to divorce me at a family dinner. Wanted witnesses to what she imagined would be my humiliation. Wanted her father there to see that she'd finally come to her senses. Wanted the validation that came from her family watching her make the right choice. She called it a family dinner, but everyone knew what it really was. An intervention. An execution. A public severing of the mistake she'd made 3 years earlier when she'd married someone so obviously beneath her station. Eleanor called me 2 days before the dinner with a story about wanting to celebrate Terence's recent promotion. Jasmine texted to confirm I'd be there, adding that we needed to have an important conversation afterward. Even that word choice was revealing. Afterward, like the family audience was the main event and our marriage ending was just the epilogue. I confirmed I'd attend. I told Jasmine I was looking forward to it. I even asked if she wanted me to bring anything. She told me just to bring myself, and there was something in her tone, not cruelty exactly, but a kind of finality that suggested she'd already moved on emotionally and was just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. The days before that dinner were strange. I went about my normal routines while knowing everything was about to change. I had breakfast meetings with founders who wanted my investment advice. I reviewed contracts for my position on the board of a healthcare company that was about to disrupt the insurance industry. I signed documents approving a $20 million investment in a clean energy startup. And then I'd come home to Jasmine, who'd look up from her phone, probably texting Marcus, and ask how my day was with the kind of disinterest that comes from already being emotionally divorced. I spent time with my lawyer, Jerome Washington, going over everything one final time. Jerome had been my attorney since my second company exit. He was sharp, discreet, and thoroughly unimpressed by people like the Whitmores. He'd grown up in Roxbury, worked his way through law school, made partner at one of Boston's top firms through sheer brilliance and refusal to accept anyone's limitations. He understood exactly what we were doing and why. The prenup Jasmine had insisted I sign was our nuclear weapon. It was so focused on protecting her assets that it never addressed mine. In Massachusetts law, that created an interesting situation. Assets acquired during marriage were generally community property unless specifically exempted by prenuptial agreement. The Whitmore's document exempted Jasmine's trust fund and inheritance. It was silent on everything else, which meant that $300 million of my portfolio growth during our marriage was technically community property. Jasmine would ordinarily be entitled to half, $150 million, except for the infidelity clause. That beautifully specific clause that Reginald's lawyers had included to protect their daughter from a cheating fortune hunter. The clause that specified any spouse who committed adultery would forfeit all claims to community property. The clause that was about to trap Jasmine instead. Jerome had compiled everything into folders. Bank statements showing my actual net worth. Corporate documents showing my ownership stakes. Tax returns going back a decade. Investment records. Property titles, including the brownstone Jasmine thought her father had bought. And then Keisha's entire investigation, photographs, text messages, bank records showing hotel charges, testimony from Marcus himself about the nature of his relationship with my wife. We had everything. We'd built a case so airtight that even the Whitmore's high-priced attorneys wouldn't be able to argue their way out of it. And we'd done it quietly, carefully, while Jasmine and her family had been so confident in their assessment of me that they'd never thought to look deeper. The night before the dinner, I barely slept. Not from anxiety. From anticipation. For 3 years I'd been invisible. For 3 years I'd been dismissed. For 3 years I'd watched people who thought they were better than me make their assumptions and their judgments and their plans. Tomorrow, all of that ended. Tomorrow, I stopped being invisible. Tomorrow, they'd finally see me clearly. And I was going to enjoy every single second of it. For everyone watching who's ever waited for the perfect moment to reveal the truth, who's ever let people underestimate them while knowing something they didn't, who's ever played the long game while everyone else rushed to judgment, this next part is for you. Like this video. Share it. Tell someone you know that patience isn't passive. Sometimes it's the most powerful move you can make. The Whitmore estate looked exactly as it always did. Imposing. Elegant. Designed to intimidate. The driveway curved through manicured grounds. The house itself was Georgian style, brick and white columns, the kind of architecture that was meant to evoke southern plantations without anyone having to acknowledge that history. Staff moved through the home with practiced invisibility. Everything was designed to remind visitors of the Whitmore family status, their permanence, their position in Boston's social hierarchy. I arrived alone. Jasmine had gone early to help her mother with preparations, which really meant she wanted time to brief everyone on what was about to happen. I could picture her in the kitchen with Eleanor, going over the plan. How she'd announce that we needed to talk. How her father would support her decision. How they'd all be kind but firm. How I'd accept the generous settlement Reginald was offering. How we'd handle this with dignity and discretion. What she couldn't picture was Jerome sitting in his car 3 blocks away, waiting for my text. Or the folders in his briefcase that would rewrite her entire future. Or the fact that every assumption she'd made about this evening was catastrophically wrong. I walked into the house like I had dozens of times before. The same portraits of Whitmore ancestors lined the walls. The same expensive furniture filled the rooms. The same subtle reminders of wealth and heritage and belonging that I was about to prove I didn't need. Everyone was already in the dining room. Reginald at the head of the table, Eleanor to his right, Terence and his wife across from where Jasmine and I would sit. And Marcus, yes, Marcus was there. Jasmine had actually brought her tennis instructor to what was supposed to be a family dinner. The audacity of it would have been impressive if it wasn't so predictable. She introduced him as a friend. Said he'd been such a support to her lately. Said she hoped nobody minded. The way she said it made clear that whether anyone minded was irrelevant, he was there, and his presence was part of the statement she was making. Look what I found. Look at the upgrade. Look at what I'm choosing instead of you. Reginald looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Eleanor smiled with the kind of forced warmth people use when they're trying to paper over obvious tension. Terence smirked. They all thought they understood what was happening. A wife bringing her affair partner to a family dinner to establish dominance before announcing divorce. Bold. Tacky perhaps. But bold. We Saturday. We made small talk. Eleanor asked about Marcus's work at the club. Reginald mentioned that he'd heard good things about the tennis program there. Jasmine was vibrant in a way I hadn't seen her in months, performing happiness, making it clear through every gesture and laugh that she'd moved on emotionally and was just tying up the loose ends of her previous life. Dinner was served. We ate. The conversation flowed around topics that didn't matter. Terence's promotion. The Family Foundation's recent gala. Plans for summer in the Hamptons. Normal family dinner conversation with the weight of what everyone knew was coming pressing down on the table like humidity before a storm. Finally, as dessert was being cleared, Jasmine put her hand on mine. The gesture was almost kind. The way you'd touch someone you were about to deliver bad news to. She said we needed to talk about our future. Actually, she corrected herself, about my future. Because it was clear to her now that they were going to be different futures. She said she'd been thinking a lot lately about what she wanted from life, what she deserved, what she'd been settling for. She said I was a good person but we'd grown apart. She said this wasn't working anymore. Then she slid the divorce papers across the table. The papers were thick. Professional. Prepared by attorneys who charged $800 an hour. I picked them up and started reading. Took my time with it. Everyone watched. Jasmine looked confident. Reginald looked satisfied. Marcus looked smug in the way that men who think they're about to upgrade their life circumstances tend to look smug. The settlement they were offering was actually generous by normal standards. $50,000. 6 months to vacate the brownstone. An agreement not to pursue any claims against Jasmine or her family. A non-disclosure agreement about the terms of our marriage and divorce. They'd thought of everything. They'd covered every angle. Every angle except the ones they didn't know existed. I read every page. Every clause. Every term. And then I signed. Didn't ask questions. Didn't negotiate. Didn't hesitate. Just took the pen Jasmine offered and signed my name on every line they'd marked. The relief in the room was almost physical. Eleanor exhaled. Terence stopped smirking and just looked satisfied. Reginald nodded like this was exactly how he'd expected things to go. Jasmine looked briefly confused. She'd expected resistance, maybe some emotion, at least some fight. My total compliance seemed to unsettle her more than argument would have. Then she recovered, reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Told me this was for the best. Told me we'd both be happier. Told me she'd always care about me even if we weren't right for each other. That's when I pulled out my phone and sent Jerome a single text, now. I looked up at the table. At these people who'd spent 3 years dismissing me. At Jasmine, who'd spent months planning her exit. At Marcus, who thought he was about to cash in on his investment in my wife. At the Whitmores, who'd never seen me as anything more than their daughter's mistake. I told them there was someone else who needed to join us. Someone who'd been helping me with some legal matters. I hope they didn't mind. Jasmine looked confused. Reginald looked annoyed. Before anyone could object, Jerome walked in. Jerome Washington didn't just enter rooms. He owned them. 6'3", impeccably tailored 3-piece suit, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month. He introduced himself. Partner at Chen and Associates. Specializing in high-net-worth divorces and complex asset division. He'd been representing me throughout my marriage. You could see the confusion crystallize across their faces. Representing me? With what money? For what purpose? Reginald recovered first. Asked what this was about. His tone was sharp, a man who didn't like surprises, especially not in his own home. Jerome smiled. Said he had some documents that needed to be shared as part of the divorce proceedings. Financial disclosures. As required by law. Surely Jasmine's attorneys had informed her that both parties needed to provide complete financial documentation? Jasmine was staring at me now. Not with anger. With something closer to fear. Like she was watching the ground shift beneath her feet and couldn't quite understand what was happening or why. Jerome opened his briefcase. Pulled out folders. Started placing them on the table with the precise care of someone arranging pieces on a chessboard. He slid the first folder to Jasmine. Suggested she look at page 1. She opened it. Her face went through a series of expressions so quickly it was almost cinematic. Confusion. Disbelief. Shock. Her hand started trembling. She looked up at me. Back down at the papers. Up at me again. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. Eleanor asked what was wrong. Jasmine couldn't answer. Eleanor reached over and looked at the papers herself. Made a small noise. Put her hand to her chest. Pushed the folder away like it was radioactive. Reginald stood up. Walked over. Picked up the folder. Read the first page. Sat back down very slowly. His face had gone from its normal ruddy color to something closer to gray. The first page was simple. Just a summary. Darius Webb net worth as of current date. $500 million. Terence grabbed the folder next. Started flipping through pages. Bank statements from Credit Suisse, Morgan Stanley, Blackstone. Investment portfolios. Property holdings. Corporate ownership stakes. Tax returns showing 8-figure annual income. Documentation of every asset, every investment, every dollar that I'd accumulated while they'd thought I was a struggling entrepreneur playing house with their daughter's money. Marcus tried to leave. Actually stood up from the table and started backing toward the door. Nobody noticed. They were all too busy staring at the documents. Jerome waited for the silence to reach its peak. Then he calmly walked them through everything. My first company exit. My second company exit. My angel investments during our marriage. The properties I'd purchased, including the brownstone they thought Reginald had bought. The $300 million in assets acquired during the marriage that would normally be community property. Jasmine's theoretical entitlement to half of that. $150 million. You could see Jasmine doing the math. See the realization dawning. See the future she'd just thrown away crystallizing in front of her. She'd been married to a man worth $500 million and hadn't known it. She'd been planning to leave him for a tennis instructor. She'd thought she was trading up. Then Jerome got to the best part. The infidelity clause. That beautiful, specific clause that Reginald's lawyers had included in the prenup. The clause that said any spouse who committed adultery forfeited all claims to community property. He started laying out evidence. Photographs of Jasmine and Marcus at the Cambridge Hotel. Text messages between them discussing their relationship. Bank statements showing Jasmine paying for hotel rooms on my credit cards. The recording of Marcus bragging about his arrangement with the woman with money who was about to leave her deadbeat husband. Marcus had made it to the door. Jerome called out to him. Asked him to stay. Said his testimony might be needed. Marcus looked at Jasmine. Jasmine looked at Marcus with an expression that would have been heartbreaking if it wasn't so predictable. Watching her realize in real time that Marcus had never wanted her. He'd wanted her money. Money she didn't actually have. Money that came from me. Money that was about to disappear from her life completely. Marcus mumbled something about having a lesson to teach. Walked out. Nobody tried to stop him. He'd served his purpose in this story. He was irrelevant now. Reginald tried to recover. Started talking about how we could work this out. Family was family. Surely we could find a reasonable settlement. There had been mistakes on both sides. These things happened. People could be mature about this. Jerome cut him off. Explained, with the patience of someone who'd explained this 100 times, that there was nothing to negotiate. The prenup they drafted protected Jasmine's assets. It was silent on mine. The infidelity clause they'd included to protect their daughter from a cheating fortune hunter applied equally to both spouses. Jasmine had violated that clause. Repeatedly. With documentation. She was entitled to exactly nothing. The brownstone? Mine. Bought with my money. Title in my name. She had 60 days to vacate. The cars? Mine. Purchased with my funds. The vacation property in Maine? Mine. Never was theirs. The furniture, the art, the belongings she thought were hers. Purchased with my money during the marriage. Legally mine. She would leave with exactly what she'd brought into the marriage. Her clothes. Her jewelry. Her trust fund that she'd been so worried about protecting. $2 million that was supposed to be her safety net. Terence asked about the $50,000 settlement they'd offered me. Asked it like he thought he'd found a loophole. Said I'd signed the papers accepting their offer. Surely that was binding. Jerome smiled. Explained that contracts signed under false pretenses weren't enforceable. That I'd signed documents that materially misrepresented the financial circumstances of both parties. that any attorney would shred that agreement in about 15 seconds. He was almost gentle about it. Almost. Eleanor started crying. Not loud, dramatic tears. Just quiet devastation. She asked me why. Why would I do this? Why would I hide who I was? Why would I let them believe something that wasn't true? I answered her. Told her I'd wanted to know if someone could love me without the money. Wanted to understand if I was worth loving for myself. Wanted to see who people really were when they thought I was beneath them. I told her I'd gotten my answer. For 3 years I'd been treated like charity. Like a project. Like someone who should be grateful for inclusion in their world. For 3 years I'd watched them judge me. For 3 years I'd listened to their certainty that they were better than me. And for 3 years, I'd been worth more than their entire family combined. Jasmine was just staring at me. Asked if any of it had been real. If I'd ever actually loved her. I told her the truth. I had loved her. Loved who I thought she was. Loved the woman who'd seemed different from her family. But that woman had either never existed or had disappeared somewhere in the 2nd year of our marriage when she'd started believing her family's assessment of me. When she'd started seeing me the way they saw me. When she decided that a tennis instructor who told her she was special was worth more than a husband who'd loved her. She tried to argue. Said she'd loved me too. Said this wasn't fair. Said I'd lied to her. Jerome packed up his folders. Told everyone that his office would be in touch with formal documentation. Told Jasmine that she should retain counsel immediately. Told Reginald that any attempts to interfere with the divorce proceedings would be documented and potentially actionable. He shook my hand. Nodded to the table. Left. I stood up. Told them I'd be staying at a hotel while Jasmine packed her things. Told her she had 60 days but I'd prefer it was sooner. Told the family that I hoped they'd learned something from this experience, though I doubted they had. Reginald tried one last time. Said we could still fix this. Said Jasmine had made mistakes but so had I. Said family was more important than money. I told him he was wrong. Family was exactly as important as how you treated people. And they'd show me exactly what I was worth to them. Nothing. Less than nothing. A embarrassment. A mistake. A charity case. Now they knew what I was actually worth. And it didn't change anything. I still wasn't family to them. I was just the mistake who happened to be rich. I walked out of that house and didn't look back. For everyone who's ever been underestimated, who's ever let people dismiss them while knowing they were wrong, who's ever played the long game and won, this story is yours. Like this video if you felt that. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe because stories like this, stories about quiet victories and patient justice, matter. Hit that notification bell because there's more to tell. The aftermath unfolded exactly as you'd expect. Jasmine hired attorneys. They reviewed Jerome's documentation. They called me seeking settlement negotiations. We declined. They filed motions arguing that I'd committed fraud by concealing my assets. A judge reviewed the prenup the Whitmores had drafted and asked Jasmine's lawyers why their client's document hadn't included provisions for both parties' assets. They had no good answer. The legal proceedings took 6 months. 6 months of motions and countermotions and depositions and discovery. 6 months of Jasmine's lawyers trying to find any angle, any argument, any legal theory that would entitle her to something. 6 months of Jerome methodically destroying every attempt. The final divorce decree was almost anticlimactic. The marriage was dissolved. Jasmine received nothing beyond her premarital assets. I received nothing of hers. We walked away from each other completely cleanly, except she walked away from the life she'd thought was hers and I walked away from people who'd never seen me clearly. The social fallout was more interesting. Boston's wealthy circles are small and gossipy. The story of the Whitmore daughter who divorced her secretly wealthy husband for a tennis instructor became the kind of scandal that people discussed in hushed tones at country clubs and charity galas. Reginald's reputation took a hit. People wondered how he could have so thoroughly misjudged his son-in-law. Eleanor stopped hosting her regular social events. Terence kept his head down at work. Marcus got fired from the country club. Apparently several members had decided they didn't want their wives taking private lessons from him anymore. Last I heard he'd moved to Florida to teach at a resort. Probably still looking for his big score. Jasmine moved back to her parents' estate. Her trust fund was still intact, still $2 million, still providing her a comfortable life by any normal standard. But she'd gone from planning to be a billionaire's wife to being a 30-something divorcee living with her parents, and that particular trajectory was hard to spin positively. I sold the brownstone. Too many memories of playing a role I didn't need to play anymore. Bought a penthouse in the Seaport district with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor. Started actually using my name in business contexts instead of hiding behind anonymous investment entities. Accepted board positions I'd previously declined. Started speaking at tech conferences about entrepreneurship and angel investing. People who'd known me as Jasmine's struggling entrepreneur husband started recognizing me as Darius Webb, the tech founder and investor. The cognitive dissonance was entertaining. Several people apologized once they realized who I actually was. I accepted their apologies politely and never spoke to them again. I started a foundation. The Webb Foundation for First-Generation Entrepreneurs. Focused on supporting founders from working-class backgrounds, particularly people of color, particularly people who'd been told they didn't belong in spaces they'd worked their entire lives to access. I funded it with $50 million and hired a staff who understood that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage you could have. And I started dating again. Actually dating. As myself. Not as a persona. Not as a test of who could love me without the money. Just as Darius. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. That's where I met Keisha. Yes, the same Keisha who'd been my private investigator. We'd stayed in touch after the divorce was finalized. She'd moved on to other cases, but we'd grab coffee occasionally. She was brilliant, skeptical, completely unimpressed by wealth, and interested in me specifically because I'd hired her to document my wife's affair instead of confronting it like a normal person. She found the whole thing psychologically fascinating. Our first actual date was to a dive bar in Dorchester. She ordered whiskey neat and asked me why I'd really hidden my money from Jasmine. Not the story I told myself. The real reason. I told her the truth. That I'd been afraid. Afraid that my first relationship had ended because of money and my second would end the same way. Afraid that I'd never know if someone loved me or loved what I represented. Afraid that wealth had somehow made me less lovable instead of more. She asked if I'd figured out the answer. I told her I had. That wealth didn't make you lovable or unlovable. That it just revealed who people actually were. That Jasmine would have been exactly as shallow and status-obsessed whether I'd been rich or poor. That her family would have been exactly as dismissive and condescending regardless. That I'd spent 3 years blaming money for something that was actually about character. Keisha said that was probably the healthiest conclusion I could have reached and ordered another round. We've been together for 8 months now. She still calls me out when I'm being ridiculous. Still refuses to let me pay for everything even though we both know I could buy everything she's ever wanted without noticing the expense. Still treats me like Darius, not like Darius the tech founder worth $500 million. It's the most honest relationship I've ever had. I ran into Jasmine 6 months after the divorce was finalized. Completely by accident. I was at a charity gala for the Webb Foundation. She was there with her parents, part of their attempt to rehabilitate their social standing. We ended up near each other during the cocktail hour. She looked good. Tired, but good. She'd cut her hair shorter. Wore less makeup. Looked more like the woman I'd met in Martha's Vineyard and less like the woman she'd become in her family's orbit. We found ourselves in a quiet hallway away from the crowd. The conversation was inevitable. We both knew it. She apologized. Not for the divorce. Not for Marcus. For not seeing me. For letting her family's assessment become her own. For choosing comfort over curiosity. For being exactly as small as I'd probably always feared she was. I told her I forgave her. Meant it too. Holding on to anger at this point would have just been exhausting. She'd made her choices. I'd made mine. We'd both gotten what we deserved. She asked the question I'd been waiting for. Why didn't I just tell her from the beginning? Why the 3 years of playing poor? Why the elaborate deception? I gave her the same answer I'd given her mother. That I'd wanted to know if someone could love me without the money. That I'd been testing her and she'd failed. That it wasn't really fair and I knew that, but I'd done it anyway. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I didn't expect. She said she was glad. Glad it had happened the way it did. Glad I'd hidden who I was. Because if I'd been honest from the beginning, she would have married me for different reasons. Would have loved the wealth and the status and the security. Would have been the perfect wife to Darius Webb, tech founder and investor. Would have never cheated. Would have never given me a reason to leave. And she would have been miserable. Because she would have been performing a role instead of being herself. And I would have been miserable too, because I would have spent our entire marriage wondering if she'd loved me or loved what I could provide. The hiding, the deception, the 3 years of playing poor, it had given us both clarity. She'd shown me exactly who she was. And in doing so, she'd set us both free. I asked if she was okay. Really okay. She said she was getting there. That moving back in with her parents had been humbling in ways she'd needed. That losing everything she'd thought was hers had forced her to figure out who she was beyond her family's money and expectations. That she'd started actually working at the family foundation instead of just showing up for board meetings. That she was dating someone new, a teacher she'd met through volunteer work, someone who had no idea about her family's wealth and didn't care. She asked about me. If I was happy. I told her about Keisha. About the foundation. About finally living as myself instead of as some carefully constructed persona. About how it turned out that being seen clearly was worth more than being loved blindly. She smiled. Said that sounded like something I'd say. Said she hoped I found what I was looking for. Said she hoped we both did. We went back to the gala. Back to our separate lives. Back to being strangers who'd once known each other in a very specific and complicated way. I watched her talk with her parents across the room. Watched Reginald's careful smile, Eleanor's forced warmth. Watched the performance of a family that had learned nothing from what had happened but had learned to hide their disappointment better. And I felt nothing. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Not even the pleasure of revenge. Just a quiet certainty that I'd made the right choice. That walking away from people who couldn't see me had been the only move that made sense. That sometimes the best revenge wasn't proving people wrong. It was just being happy without them. For everyone who's watched this story, who've stuck with it through 50 minutes of me explaining how I spent 3 years being invisible to prove a point, thank you. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been judged by their appearance, their background, their current circumstances instead of who they actually are. It's about everyone who's ever been told they're not enough when they were always more than enough. It's about everyone who's ever played the long game while everyone else rushed to judgment. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt underestimated or dismissed or invisible to people who thought they were better than you, I need you to do something. Like this video. Not for the algorithm, though that helps. Like it because it means something to you. Because you see yourself in this story. Because you understand what it means to be unseen. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. With someone who's being told they're not good enough. With someone who's letting other people define their worth. With someone who needs to be reminded that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage you can have. Subscribe to this channel. Because this isn't the only story like this. Because there are thousands of stories about quiet victories and patient justice and people who refused to let others define who they were. Because these stories matter and someone needs to tell them. And turn on notifications. Because the next story might be even better than this one. Because you deserve to hear about people who played the long game and won. Because sometimes, in a world that tells you to prove yourself constantly, the most powerful move is to wait until the perfect moment to reveal who you've been all along. My name is Darius Webb. I signed my divorce papers with a smile. My wife thought she was leaving me for someone better. She didn't know I was worth $500 million. And by the time she found out, it was already too late. Sometimes the best revenge isn't proving people wrong. It's just being happy without them. Thanks for listening to my story.